Hi, thank you for tuning in. Pleased to have James Harrigan and Antony Davies with us today. They're going to work with students a little bit later and record a live Words and Numbers podcast. And I'll put a link in the description where you can check out their podcast. It's absolutely fantastic. It's become part of my regular listening. But kind enough to join me here today to just chat a little bit. And the topic we decided to talk about was price controls. And wanted to get the take, some of your thoughts. And what got me thinking about this was over the weekend, Pfizer announced they're going to raise the price of their COVID vaccine from the $30 they're charging now to about $110 and $130. That's what they said the range would be. And I'm wondering, there are some people who are coming out and saying, oh, well, this proves we should socialize medicine, or we need price caps on prescription drugs or on vaccines. And pretty sure I know what your thoughts are, but I'm hoping you could articulate what are your thoughts when you hear somebody call for price caps on prescription drugs?
So I use the analogy, or story, I should say, when we were first married, had our first child, and young couple, we want to get out, we get a babysitter so we can get out together. So we got this babysitter, and we went out for dinner, and we're coming back, and my wife says, "Oh my gosh, I don't have any cash. I need cash to pay the babysitter." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, I got to pay the babysitter." I said, "Don't pay the babysitter." And she looks at me, as wives do, wives of economists. And I said, "No, I'm serious. What's she going to do? What can she do? Take back the babysitting?" Right? And then that got us into this discussion of, why do you pay the babysitter? You don't pay the babysitter for the babysitting that was just done. You're paying so that the babysitter picks up the phone the next time you call. And so too with drugs. You see this price of drugs. You're not paying for the drug in front of you. You're paying for the R&D of the next one. And you want to hold those prices down? Fine. We'll get COVID drugs. We'll get them cheap. Everyone will be happy. It'll be the last drug you ever see.
Well, I think all of that's right, but there's another, I think, a deeper way to look at this, and it's market-based. How many different companies were making vaccines? And Pfizer's one of them. Well, what's going to happen with the others? They're not going to follow suit, and if they did, then they would just sequentially take it right back down again. Things get priced down over time. So I'm not that concerned about this. I think Pfizer has every right to try to make as much as they can, and clearly they've done market research and they know that this amount is not an amount that scares people away. It may be too high for certain groups of people, but it's certainly not too high for Pfizer's main audience.
Yeah, but the comeback there is going to be, but Pfizer has a monopoly on this, and so you're not going to get competitors coming in and undercutting the price. To which I respond, where did that monopoly come from? It came from the federal government.
But it's nonsense. There isn't even a monopoly, right? You can get Johnson & Johnson.
Right. Technically, it's not a monopoly. But
right.
If there's a lack of competition, I would argue the problem is the government itself in saying, okay, verily, we bless this person. You're the only person allowed, the only company allowed to produce this thing.
So, I mean, like for prescription drugs in general, there for the COVID vaccines, there are other options. But, there are some prescription drugs where there really aren't good options. Mm-hmm. And then, you run into this question of, really, it's the patent that's giving the firm the monopoly.
Right. That's right. And we don't want to make it seem like they shouldn't get a patent.
Correct.
Right, after expending all the research and development to get a drug through a very, very difficult process. Surely we want them to be able to make a profit.
Yep.
Why? And again, it's the same question. How are you going to get the next drug?
Yeah, but see, there's something else going on there, which is, and I agree with you, you invest billions of dollars, and there should be some protection there. The problem is companies have learned how to use these patents in predatory manner. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to patent not just the drug I market, but I'm going to patent all sorts of variations on it that I never intend to market, just so that you can't.
That's right.
That's a problem.
And it is a problem. They've learned to game the system.
Right.
Now, I can't blame them for gaming the system. That's what corporations do. I can blame the government for creating the system.
Right.
I think we'd be healthier with a completely hands-off approach to patent law with the government in terms of drugs. It just seems to do nobody any good.
So a question that I have, and we were talking before offline, I'm writing up an article that I hope to submit, and we'll see who knows. By the time you see this, if it went well, you've seen the article. By the time this is out on video. But the arguing, so they're raising the price. By them raising this price, and they're I can't foresee any way they're going to be stopped on this. It will induce other companies to, they'll see, okay, there are enormous profits to be made.
Yep.
Because it wasn't just, Pfizer invested, but there were several companies
That's
that
right.
invested, I don't know if it's tens of millions of dollars trying to develop this vaccine, and they failed, and they just lost that money.
Right.
So I guess a key question then, by having this price increase, could it be conceivable that actually lives will be saved? Firms would see this, firms would see the fact that there are these enormous profits to be made and maybe invest a little bit more? Or is this patent gaming, you think, such a problem that really wouldn't happen?
Yeah, I don't know the particulars there as to how much is gaming and how much isn't, but I think you raise a really important point that the higher the price goes, and all we see is that price going up, and we, are looking at that saying this is horrible, but the higher that price goes, the louder it's calling out to competitors of find a cheaper solution and you can share in this. Oh,
Yeah.
and to our benefit, it's going to drive the price back down again.
Yeah. You're asking ultimately about unintended consequences here. What will happen? And boy, hell if I know. Right? This is always where we are.
Sure.
I'm inevitably shocked by what does happen. I almost never get it right. And I don't think anybody else does either. That's why it's so interesting to talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah, and one of the unintended consequences that's sitting here is coming from the FDA. So, you're saying it costs millions of dollars to produce these drugs. And in part, that's caused by the requirements that we've set down and said, look, you have to go through all of this testing. The testing is incredibly expensive. And we do it with good intention. You want to protect people
Sure.
from bad drugs, but we've got to understand the unintended consequence.
Yeah,
and the
and
unintended consequence is it makes the drugs that finally do hit the market that much more
And
expensive.
I've got a brief story about bad drugs, right? Like an idiot, one day, I got in an airplane and I moved to Iraq. And I can't...
As one does, right? Like it was
The way you-
Thursday.
the way you
yeah,
do.
Yeah.
And, so 38 hours and however many miles later, I'm living there. And I brought a big box of all of my various medications. Because I'm always, I've got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. So I bring all these drugs with me, and sooner or later, they all run out. And we had a handler, and I said, I need to get refills. What can I do? And he said, I'll come and get you. We'll go to the pharmacy. Apparently, you can just do that. There's no need to go talk to somebody else.
Yeah.
You just wander on in. So to the pharmacy I went. But before I got there, it was a place that kind of rumor spread widely and almost instantaneously. And on my walk from my office to the car, 3 people stopped me. They said, I hear you're going to the pharmacy. The hell, right? How do you know this?
Yeah.
They said, whatever you do, don't take the Chinese drugs. And I said, really? I said, who should I take? They said, Syrian, Saudi, anybody but China. I said, all right. Then the next person said it, and the next did too. And we went from there to the pharmacy, and what do you think the pharmacy pushed out, right? A bunch of Chinese meds. And I looked at it and said, oh, no way. And they put them aside, and then the other ones came. So, are drugs regulated there? Well, no, but kind of. Right?
Yeah, the market does the regulating.
Right.
It kind of does for the most part, right?
Yeah.
And if I hadn't been among people who knew me and we could speak English together, it would have been very, very difficult.
Sure.
But it was never impossible, and I've always found that moment to be deeply fascinating. I walked out with every med I needed, and they were not Chinese. And they all
Wow.
worked, and they all worked just
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In thinking through, so the prices are increasing. People are talking about price controls in general. I'm curious of how the relation, if there was an attempt to put in price controls on prescription drugs, would we perhaps see similar issues to what we see with rent control in some of the cities? Or is the prescription drug market just different enough? In some ways, I don't think it's different. It's largely because if you want to building apartment buildings or building houses where people could rent, whereas if you impose rent control, right, you've got a stable housing a moment. For that exact moment in time, renters might be getting a better deal, but then the supply starts to drop.
Right.
In future. So I'm wondering if that would seem a parallel, or if there's something I might
No,
be
I think
missing.
that's absolutely right. And I think where people go wrong when it comes to thinking about price controls is they misconstrue. They start to think about price as a cause rather than as an effect. When a price is high, it's reflecting something that's going on in the market. and you can arbitrarily pull it down, but you haven't fixed the problem. The problem is still there because the high price is not the cause, it's the effect. And so you talk about rent control, and we've seen this over and over again. Why it's still a question is beyond me.
It is baffling.
But every city that tries it, they'll put in rent control prices so the prices don't go above a certain amount. And what happens? You get a shortage of housing, which is exactly what economists will tell you get. In fact, there was an interesting story. This would have been back in the 80s. New York City with its rent controls, your rent can't go above a certain amount, whatever it is. And what would happen is people wouldn't let go of their rentals. So I've got this place, I'm renting it for, let's say, $500, and I don't want to let it go because, well, that's rent controlled. And, somewhere else it would cost $2,000, and so it comes time for me to move. Well, what I do here is, see, the rent control applies to the landlord. It doesn't apply to me, the renter. So I'll sublet my place I'm paying $500 for. I'll sublet it to James for $700. So he pays me $700 a month. I pay the landlord $500, and then James wants to move out, but $700 is a good price, so he'll sublet to you for $1,000.
There's a chain.
There was a chain of like 20 long.
Oh, man.
And what's happening is, at the end of that chain, the person is paying the $2,000.
Sure.
The price that you hoped that they wouldn't pay because of price rent control. So you've got people still paying this price, and yet you've got a shortage of housing. Why? Because that $2,000 never makes it to the landlord. It just goes to this sequence of renters that you have in between.
And rent-controlled cities start to look like war zones.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
right.
they're just grim when you see what's wrought by this sort of thinking. And it happens over and over and over. There's never a counter-example. You can't point to a city and say, see, they did it right here.
Right. Rent control actually works.
It
doesn't work.
And we see that answer to a lot of things. And sooner or later, people just have to be a little less clueless, I think, is the only way to put it.
Well, but I think, Matt, you touched on it earlier when you said, is the rent control market like the drug market? If price controls work this way here, will they work that way there? And I think that's where people go so wrong so often. They say, yeah, but in this market, it's different.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's the same phenomenon. It's a different product, but it's the same phenomenon.
How? And I mean, I asked you about rent control. How badly have people lost on language when we're still using that term, because it doesn't control rent.
Right. Yeah, no, that's
I mean,
that's right.
And I used it, right?
That's
it's the common verbiage of everybody who knows it doesn't work. We still call it rent control.
Right.
We still say minimum wages when, a minimum wage law, right? As discussed, the minimum wages
Zero.
It's zero if somebody's not working on that, and yeah, we win. Before I get to the next question, behind somewhere on, I won't try to point over, is a few copies of your book are on the shelf there. So James and Antony wrote Cooperation and Coercion, and from what I understand, it came out right of the book tour.
Like 48 hours before COVID lockdown.
That's right.
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong?
Fast. It's a great book. If you check out the podcast, you probably could also be an Audible or a book on tape.
It's on Audible also,
that you got whoever, I don't know who you got to record it, but they did a great job.
It wasn't our doing.
That's good to hear.
Yeah,
I've never
but I
listened.
think you did do a good job. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it was well done on that, so I highly recommend that book.
Thank you.
So, flipping over to governments messing with prices, go the other way, and I mentioned minimum wages. Minimum wages are ones where you talked about there are people who will say, oh, but here are the examples where minimum wages are good. Yeah. Curious of what some of the examples that you hear are that people bring up but you think don't hold quite as much credibility on where people say, well, but minimum wage really is okay because of these particular examples or in this particular situation.
But see, that's the thing. It's always these particular examples, and you can point to all sorts of instances in which somebody was just scraping by at $7.25 an hour, and $15 minimum wage comes along, and they're doing much better, and all of this, and that's fine. You can find examples like that, but you can also find examples on the other end where the person was just scraping by at $7.25 an hour, and now is destitute because they're making nothing because no one will hire the guy's not worth $15 an hour.
And think about the power here that underlies this entire thing. Presidents will point at the State of the Union, point into the into the crowd and say, well, and Mrs. Smith there, she's done so much better. And when a president of the United States stands there, points to a victim who is no longer a victim, that's a story that's so easy to tell, right? Anybody wins if that's what you need to do. But if you need to look at the data and you need to take into account how many people lost so that some people could win, well, now it's a different story entirely.
Yeah, and it's not just a comparison of how many lost versus how many won. It's who lost and who won. Because generally, when you raise the minimum wage, say to $15 an hour, the employer looks around and he says, okay, who's worth $15 an hour?
Sure.
People who are worth $15 an hour keep their jobs, people who aren't lose them. And who are the people who aren't worth $15 an hour? That's the people we should be most concerned about.
Those are the people that they say the minimum wage increase is designed to
Exactly.
help, and yet it doesn't.
Yeah.
Because if you're a business owner, you will subtract from your employees anybody who is not worth the $15 an hour. And notice the language I'm using. It's not that they are not worth it. It's that their labor.
They're not adding the profits.
Right,
to
That's right.
15,
Their labor leads to a net
And
loss.
There's a point where 14-year-old me, I wasn't grateful at the time, but was grateful that the minimum wage was $3.90 when I started at a Hardee's, because it would not have been worth, inflation adjusted. I mean, $3.90 is probably double now from the early '90s, but so I wouldn't have been worth, if that was $8, I wouldn't have been worth $13 then, or like double, an extra $1 or $2 an hour.
People forget that when they're given a job, that's a big deal to the person that hired them.
Yeah.
It's a big deal to the recipient too. But the job creator is saying, look, I have a certain amount of faith in you that you will add to my bottom line.
Yep.
I need these tasks done. I think you can do it. If you can, you'll be here as long as you want.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're adding more to the bottom line than you're ever subtracting.
Yeah. I think the language around it is often so disparaging, and even we're using worth, and we don't mean to people like
that's right.
I had minimum wage job back in the day. The skills you gain from any job where you show up, I don't think I'd be here today if I hadn't, as a 14-year-old, started to go in and learn. Okay, I don't want to be here today, but I have a job. I have to show up.
Yeah,
that's right.
This customer is rude. I don't get to say something to him. I'm saying, okay, I'll make sure I'll get you a new fry, right? Like, how can I make you happy? Yeah. How can I fix this for you?
I say this often. The most powerful sentence ever uttered here in the United States is, how may I help you?
Yeah.
If you think about what that sentence encapsulates, 5 words, change the world. Absolutely change the world.
And I had no idea I was getting that. None. When I was 14, and I worked there a year and a half. No clue. I was gaining those skills that would help me out the rest of my life.
Yeah. But now, someone who's listening to this conversation might say in response, okay, well, I hear all this, but still, what do we do about the person who can't survive because, he's not worth $15 an hour, whatever it is? And I go back to my earlier statement of make sure you get the cause and the effect right. If the person can only earn $7.25 an hour, that's the effect. It's not the cause. Or arbitrarily raising the wage rate doesn't change the reality. The reality needs to be changed is this person needs job skills, needs education, needs training, whatever it is. And to the extent we want to help those people, that's where our effort should be aimed, not at arbitrarily changing a minimum wage.
And I'm generally pretty libertarian, in terms of thinking, but we want to protect those who can't.
Of course.
Help.
Yeah, right.
Of course.
When we do that, we do not want to do it in a way that prevents people from working who can work. So if it's going to be, I think on one of your recent podcasts you mentioned something about giving away. It'd be better if we just gave $10,000 away to the poor every year, right? And then, okay, that doesn't affect work incentives at least.
Well, yeah, and I want to come back to that because the way we phrase the minimum wage is from the perspective of the employer. And we say, okay, the employers have to pay $15 an hour. Okay, but there's an equally valid way to phrase it from the perspective of the worker, which is we're saying to the worker, you may not sell your labor unless you can find someone willing to pay $15 an hour. Now, all of a sudden, I say, well, wait a minute, it's my body, it's my labor. Where do you get off telling me I can't sell it? But that's what the law does.
And that gets us back to 14-year-old you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, these were not legal things that we all did when I mowed lawns, right? And the people would give me cash, I'd put it in my pocket. I was shocked that first time I got a legitimate paycheck by just how little was in it compared to my hourly rate times the hours worked.
Right.
Radically different, and I took a very bad lesson that day.
Yeah.
But I want to get back to something you said that was interesting, because I think we all think this but never talk about it. You said that you learned as a 14-year-old some skills that are still with you today. So what is it that gets you from 14 years old to dean of a business school? I mean, you have succeeded to a tremendous level, right?
Yeah.
Something 14-year-old you probably would never have predicted. So what is it that stuck with you over time?
Well, I mean, I would think, one is the idea of showing up and working. Two, could I point to any specific one skill? Probably not. But I learned, one, to always, you show up. You show up when you have to work. You're there for the whole shift. You're kind to people. You learn to deal with rough customers. Okay. And that helped get me, because I had that job, then I got a job once as a telemarketer, speaking of another job that's, not the most pleasant, and but it paid a little bit more. And then I learned even a little bit more about I'm never afraid to make a cold call to somebody.
Yep, right.
And nothing can be worse than what I heard on the phones there, right, as a telemarketer. And a lot of, as you say, right, how can I help you?
Yeah.
I view a lot of, we were talking earlier, I love solving problems in this role, and I love being an entrepreneur in this role,
Yeah.
and a lot of that's coming down. How can I help current students? Okay, it's a very different level of how can I help you have a good meal and a good experience at a restaurant. But certainly, I wasn't thinking of any of that. If you'd asked me to name a dean, I probably would have named Dean Wormer from Animal House. Right? That would have been, I don't want to
the
be that
archetypical
guy.
dean. Sure.
Yeah. But no, that's thanks. Really appreciate your insights on this. Excited to have you talk with our students again.
Thank you for having me.
Very happy to be here.
So this pod, by the time this comes out, this will likely come out before, I would imagine I don't know your timeline, before the Words and Numbers
probably
podcast comes out. But be looking out, because there will be one with a live recording where our students are here later tonight. So Antony, James, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for watching. If you like this, please click like and subscribe, and you'll get more content like this, and we'll see you in the next video.